spiel, so you might, yeah. Great, well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see such a hearty audience on such a cold night. Thank you all for heading out into this frigid temperature to be here tonight. I have to tell you, I think it's worth it. I spent over an hour today talking to Evan about his book, and it's a real treat to have him here, and I think we're going to be in for a really great conversation. I see a lot of familiar faces tonight, but also some new ones. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Patrick Spiro. I'm the Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society. Earlier, I was the librarian of the Society for 8 years. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you to our first lecture of 2025. On your seats tonight, you'll see a schedule of events that we have coming up for the rest of what I like to refer to as the semester. I still like to think I'm on the college campus. This is the place, the APS is the life of the mind. So, and I hope you all will come out as frequently as you can. And if you can't come out, we try and stream all of our events online. So we're here tonight not just to talk about a really great book, but also to honor our founder, Benjamin Franklin. This is his birthday observed. It is the 319th birthday. It's also the excuse for me to wear my Benjamin Franklin socks. Yeah. And it's great to honor him because Franklin is still with us in so many different ways. He's with us in spirit. His ideas live on. And there are the institutions that he gave to us, institutions like the American Philosophical Society. So on this night, I just want to talk a little bit, before we have Evan come up here, about the Society, what Franklin envisioned for us, and what we do today. So we were founded in 1743. We are the nation's oldest and most distinguished learned society. What Franklin said, and this is the proposal to create the APS, it's really an inspiring document. It was an inspired idea in 1743, and if you read it today, I think you'll find it's still inspiring today. And what Franklin said was, at this moment in our nation's history, we weren't yet a nation, but the colonies were beginning to build institutions to support civil society. They were creating universities, hospitals, schools, insurance companies. And what he said is there's all these great promising people, all these great ideas that are bubbling up in these colonies, but as you can see here, he's worried that they're dying, and they die with their discoverers. There's not a way to share this knowledge with each other and share it with the wider world. So we proposed the American Philosophical Society. Our full title is the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia, for promoting useful knowledge. And what's remarkable is what we do today is very much exactly how Franklin outlined what we should do in 1743. We elect members after a distinguished career advancing knowledge. We have over 800 elected members in the United States, over 100 Nobel laureates. We hold meetings here in Philadelphia to share cutting-edge research. We have 2 annual meetings of members. The members descend from all over the world here to Philadelphia to share the latest research in all different fields. Our motto, as you can see on the seal, is nullo discrimine. We believe all knowledge can be useful. We also hold a number of other events. Our library hosts 2 conferences, lunch at the libraries, and we do evening events like this to bring Philadelphians together to share knowledge with each other. We have the longest continuously operating press in North America. I've been saying that for 10 years. No one's corrected me, so it must be true. Our first issue was in 1771. We continue to publish books, and we have 2 journals, the Proceedings and the Transactions. We also support research, direct research. We provide over 300 research grants every year to, again, scholars in all different fields who are conducting research around the globe. And then finally, we have a library and museum that's developed over time and today holds over 14 million pages of manuscripts. And we continue to collect. We have the papers of 7 Nobel laureates, which I also say is the most of any independent research library in America. And no one's corrected me on that yet either. And we have a museum that will be opening soon in April. Our next exhibition is A Revolutionary City. It's a story of Philadelphia in the American Revolution. And that'll be opening in April of this year in Philosophical Hall. And we've been on the cutting edge for these over 280 years. We've supported a number of research. We've always been pushing the frontiers of knowledge. We supported the Lewis and Clark expedition, a number of the pioneering scientific expeditions in the 19th century. And what I'd like to point out is that last item, that we may be an old and venerable institution, but we're always innovating and evolving. And 20 years ago, we created what was the first fund in astrobiology to support research into outer space to identify potential life in outer space. So we continue to be on the cutting edge today. And so I get asked all the time, how do you do it? And the answer is you all. We are supported primarily through philanthropy, and we have an incredible Friends program, and you can have information on your seats today about our Friends program. The Friends program support all facets of the Philosophical Society. Dozens of our research grant recipients, most of whom are early career scholars, receive support from the Friends program. This lecture series is underwritten by the Friends program. And Friends receive a lot of different benefits by being part of our intellectual community. You can participate in events like this. Before every talk, we have a reception where you can meet with the authors. Friends at a certain level are able to attend our members' meetings in April and November. We have salons with it showcase cutting-edge research. So consider joining the Friends. I hope to see you all at our Friends events as well as at our public lectures like this. So, with that, I would like to invite Evan Friss to come up and we can talk about his book. Now, Evan, Evan. I'm going to put this up here. So, Evan is a professor of history at James Madison University, which is where I went to undergraduate. And where I entered as a freshman, as a history major, but having no intention of being a historian. I didn't know that was an actual profession. I didn't know you could be a professor, which you are now. But it was at James Madison that really my eyes were open, my career, my life was transformed on that campus, and it's an incredible honor to have one of those professors up here tonight who's doing that every day, I know, on the campus in Harrisonburg. So, welcome.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here. And after we talked this afternoon, I reached out to a few of the professors that you said were this kind of transformative, offered this transformative experience, and one of whom wrote me back and said that you should tell me a story about a student conference in Montana or something. So, but maybe afterwards.
Yeah, that is an after. That's also Chris Arndt. He's watching, I know. Yeah, and you've published now 3 books, 2 earlier ones in cycling, and now this book on the Bookshop in American history, which has gone gangbusters. And I want to encourage everybody, if you you're selling and signing books afterwards, this was an incredible delight to read. In our job, we're often paid to read books. This was just an absolute joy. My wife even commented, "I can't believe you're really focusing on this book." And it was an engaging page turner. It's also now a New York Times bestseller. And I thought we might start the conversation with the title itself. You chose The Bookshop, not The Bookstore. Why?
Well, it's a very explanatory title, but a dull title, and it was a working title. And when I first pitched it to agents and editors, I assumed that it would get changed to something sexier, but it never did. And I don't know if that was a mistake or people liked that the title was so clear, which is somewhat unusual for nonfiction books today. But I do write in the introduction about some booksellers who prefer the term bookshop rather than bookstore. And I write a bit about the derivation of the term, and bookstore first appears in the Pennsylvania Gazette, published out of Philadelphia. And so Ben Franklin is at the forefront of the American bookselling. But shop, at least in the 21st century and for much of the 20th century, conveys a sense that this is yes, it's a commercial enterprise, but it's more than that. And perhaps there's some coziness to it, there's community to it, and it feels, to some booksellers, and I don't mean to suggest that they're snobby about it, as somebody who reviewed my book in the New Yorker did, who I won't say. I don't think they're being snobby about it, but they're just trying to lean into the fact that bookstores are different than other kinds of retail outlets, and they can be welcoming and places that, I would borrow the phrase, can promote useful knowledge.
Yeah, that's great. So Franklin is where you start this story. He's not the first bookseller. There are some other ones in Boston, if I remember correctly, but one of the great things that you do in this book is you take the reader into the shop itself and try and give them a feel for what it was like to enter that store and what you'd encounter and how you'd feel. So can you take us into Franklin's bookshop?
Sure. So Franklin, like many other early booksellers, sold much more than books. And the place was very loud and busy. It was a post office, it was a printery, a bindery, as well as he was a bookseller and he sold other things. I have a short segment of the book trying to imagine what it smelled like, and the short story is not good. But a lot of that has to do with just colonial bathing habits or lack thereof. But ink, it can be very stinky, very messy. So it wasn't like, picture a sort of a picturesque bookstore, quiet, neatly arranged rows of books and kind of hushed browsing. This was not that. There were presses working, thundering presses, lots of noise, a kind of chaos. And his bookstore, like others, were this kind of proto-bookstore in this embryonic phase when the book market wasn't really large enough to have dedicated bookstores, but they were performing many different functions, and the printing and bookselling were essential. I wish I knew more about the physical characteristics of the shop, and I did a lot of research about it, and there are some renderings later on from several artists trying to imagine what this bookstore looked like. And I didn't put them in the book because I didn't have a lot of faith in those renderings. So
those renderings probably made it look like it smelled perfect, right? I mean, because the truth in the 18th century is the 18th century smelled really bad, I think.
I'm sure, yeah.
So community is something that does come up a lot in this book. Also the idea of curation, different book shops, really kind of carving out niches with certain communities. What about Franklin's? I mean, did you get any sense on what type of bookseller he was?
Yeah, so he was unusual insofar that he was a bookseller. So it was still a novelty. When he opens up his print shop, he's really one of the first in the colony, in this mid-Atlantic region, certainly in Philadelphia, to be selling books. So it does attract people who are interested in coming for his almanac, in coming for the largest selection of books were religious in nature. He printed lots of sermons, psalm books, textbooks. So it was a bit more transactional than we would see subsequent bookstores, and probably wasn't as much of a hangout as bookstores in the 19th century would be, and so maybe had less of a community in that respect. And Franklin was very busy with wide-ranging interests that took him beyond the shop often. But it still was his work home and a center of his own intellectual development, where he was printing things, reading things, thinking about things, talking about politics. So it was a kind of an important node in early Philadelphia.
And the role of his wife, Deborah, in this?
Yeah, so she seems to be first and foremost often the person people would see in this bookstore, which I'm putting in quotes. He called it was a print shop, but she did some of the binding and the books wouldn't necessarily look like books to many of us today. Many of them are sort of more like pamphlets stitched together, that she did a lot of the work. And the ledgers that are digitized, and that the American Philosophical Society has these great whiz-bang resources to pour through them and see what is selling when. A lot of the shop ledgers entries are written in her hand, suggesting that she was doing a lot of the work.
Yeah. One of the things I learned in your book was that for a brief period of time, Franklin's mother-in-law also worked in this shop. And she was selling what?
Itch cream. Yes. So for those of us who think, fish oil is a 21st century kind of invention, there are precedents for people selling all sorts of cure-alls, and she was one of them.
Yeah, that was news to me. So I really appreciated that sidebar that you had in there. So moving ahead, we had Franklin in Philadelphia, and then Boston really becomes a locus for bookselling and even the publishing industry. And you really focus in, each one of these chapters focuses on a particular shop, but then kind of broadens out to talk about bookselling and bookshops in the nation more generally, and he really focused on the old corner shop. And as a historian, I often think about continuity and change. And so there was continuity, I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but Franklin was both a publisher and a bookseller, and that's also what developed almost inadvertently at the old corner shop, and that in many ways transformed the history of publishing in the United States and also bookselling. Can you take us into that shop?
Yeah. So in the 1820s, this is in Boston, which was really the center of the print and bookselling world until New York displaces it much later in the 19th century. And I call it in the book the first real modern American bookstore. And as Pat points out, it has a lot of characteristics shared with Franklin's shop in that initially they're printing the books on site that eventually moves to a separate building. But these are both booksellers and publishers, and they go hand in hand. But the reason that it's distinct from Franklin's shop is it really does become a community, a home for readers and writers, and becomes a place where, the great American writers, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Longfellow and so many others, are not just having their works published by the old corner bookstores, these two guys, Tickner and Fields, who are running it, but they're also just hanging out in the bookstore, and people can come and find out what new books are coming out, pick up books off the shelf. I write in the book a fair bit. Oliver Wendell Holmes liked to call it book tasting, which was like he would pick up a book, what we would think of as browsing. And all of these guys were hanging out. They'd go to a coffee shop next door, and the publishers would learn from their readers, not just the famous ones, what people were interested in, and that would affect what they're publishing, and it was this ecosystem. And that kind of intimacy actually bred a lot of fascinating works, and they had some missteps, and they passed on Louisa May Alcott, and there's some other kind of funny stories in the book. But it really is this hub, a community where people are learning about new kinds of books, talking about books, and it's inflecting and influencing both publishing and book selling, and is a landmark for basically 40 years, and it eventually moves on and dissipates and forms into other publishing companies. But the building itself is still standing, and it's, I think, the oldest commercial building in all of Boston, which is now 200 years old, and it's a Chipotle.
So I was about to ask you that, because that was one of those laugh out loud moments in the book. That's how he ends the chapter.
Yes.
This big buildup of what's happened to it, and today it's a Chipotle.
Yes. That was partly my son. That's his favorite line in the book. He also loves Chipotle, so I'm going to take him to the Chipotle sometime.
Yeah. But what also emerges in that discussion of bookselling in this period of time is the tension that develops between publishers and other bookshops, and how much they're going to charge and not charge, and kind of the behind-the-scenes trade that we also still hear about today, especially with the growth of Amazon and their relationships to publishers and the like. So can you tell us a little bit about how bookshops operated as a business and in relation to publishers?
It was very common throughout even the 19th century for publishers to also be booksellers. And some of that, there are famous examples even in the 20th century, Scribner's and Doubleday and some other publishers that you're probably familiar with. So that obviously had its advantages for those firms and created some awkwardness when the publisher was selling its books to some degree, but also wanted to wholesale its books, which Ben Franklin was doing, by the way. He sold more of the books that he was printing elsewhere outside of his own bookshop, but he would wholesale them and retail them. So it created an intimacy, but also complication. And how did two different publishers deal with each other when they both had different bookstores that were rivals? So they were fighting for authors, and then they didn't know what kind of, if they were really harsh with one another, and they didn't give the other big five. And they largely moved away from bookselling and became focused on publishing, which changed the dynamic, and we had rise of chain bookstores and other kinds of things that complicated matters in a variety of ways. But I don't know that I answered your question. But there's long been one of the complications of bookselling is how much should a book cost, and what is the kind of standard discount. And retailers have long felt handicapped by the publishers in a way that's somewhat distinct from other kinds of retail outlets that tend to have higher profit margins. And eventually books, including this one, all have the price stamped on them by the publisher. So even though the publisher isn't actively selling the book, although you can buy it from the website, the price is listed there, so a bookseller can't charge more than that price, which creates a variety of constraints.
Yeah. No, and that's a theme that runs through it. I'm probably return to when we get a little bit more into the 21st century.
Although I should say this book has a market price of $30, but it's
Yes, I
advertised
know.
for $20. So that's a very good deal.
Yeah. No, we are a nonprofit, but we rely on the support of our friends. So for me, the big change came really with this, the chapter on Marshall Fields and Company, which to me, it was new, really, truly new ground to me. And I don't want to steal your thunder on that story, but here's the rise of department stores in kind of Gilded Age America, early 20th century. And a woman in Chicago at Marshall Field really kind of transforms bookselling there. Can you tell us a little bit of that story?
So I grew up in the 80s and remember the suburban mall in a somewhat nostalgic but also depressing kind of way. And one of the things that surprised me, and of course I knew about a kind of Gilded Age of department stores, and I lived in New York City. I went to grad school in the building that used to be B. Altman's. So I knew about, classy department stores. But my research, I was really surprised the degree to which department stores in general, and Marshall Fields in particular, became a leading bookseller. And many of the departments saw it as a way to attract high-class clientele. But they built out enormous and elaborate book sections. And even though these were giant operations, Marshall Field and Company, which the building still stands, takes up a whole city block in downtown Chicago. The retail square footage is many, many dozens of acres. It's just an enormous place. They had 600 horses to use for deliveries, and they would send books by horse, which I thought was romantic and nice. But it was this behemoth and corporate, the kind of just symbol of capitalism. But the bookstore was lauded as one of the greatest bookstores. The person who ran the department, her name is Marcella Honner, was a kind of bookseller's bookseller. People would go to conferences to learn about how she set up the tables and her store. And authors just descended to Marshall Fields, which really inaugurated a lot of the practices that have become standard, most notably author events, which publishers had shied away from historically and were worried that their kind of clumsy authors would be a turnoff, that it's better if Evan Friss just remains a name rather than a person, and that there was a sort of danger in tearing down this wall. But Honor brought in authors all the time, and there's lots of details in the book, and I won't go into them all, but really created one of the both largest and also greatest bookstores in the country. And it was just a remarkable thing that it lived inside of a department store. And it lasted for many, many decades. It eventually, like the department store model itself, lost some of its allure.
She was in many ways an influencer before that term existed. She could make or break authors.
Absolutely. So authors would go to her, prospective authors, and say, do you think there's a book here? And she could call up a publisher in New York and make it happen or not. She was an early supporter of things like crossword books, which were a big gamble when Simon & Schuster started publishing them. People thought, they were fun, but this wasn't something that people would buy in this kind of package. And sometimes she just said, I think there should be a book about this. and would find somebody to write it. In a couple of cases, she wrote books herself. And she was such a tastemaker that people would follow her orders. So if she ordered 5,000 copies of some book, I wouldn't say guaranteed the success of that book, but it made it very likely that this book was going to take off, not just in her shop, but in so many others around the country. It would make the news, literally the newspaper, that Marcella Burns-Honor, ordered big on so-and-so's new novel.
And she also created the Modern Book Festival in some...
Yeah, so just like breaking down the wall between author and reader at individual book talks, she had the idea of creating a book fair. She went to an automobile fair in Chicago, and was bored out of her mind. It was like, but this is a great concept, but who cares about, tires or carburetors? I don't know if there were carburetors back then. I don't know anything about cars. Scratch that.
Bicycles.
Yeah, I know bicycles. But she's so, and again, this struck many people as crazy. Why would the different publishers all come to some book fair and set up a table next to each other? But they did when she called, and it was this very elaborate spectacle, and there were different booths, and they brought out famous authors, and they also had kind of memorabilia, and they set up small exhibitions, and hundreds of thousands of people over the course of a week came, and it was a great success and a model for the kind of commercialization of books that happened across the country, but again, in a way that wasn't seen as, selling out, but was tasteful.
Yeah, and so I studied the 18th century. I had never heard of Marcella Honor before. I mean, does her legacy loom large somewhere, or did you have to resurrect it? And where were you doing the research on something like Marshall Field and Company?
Yeah, hardly anybody has ever heard of her, unfortunately, which is amazing to think. Most of her work was between the world wars, and she ran the department for effectively those 3 decades, and is largely forgotten. Luckily, now Marshall Field's, the store as Marshall Field's doesn't exist today, it's a Macy's. So many of the records remain at the Chicago Historical Society, which is one of the reasons I was able to profile it. So I spent a good deal of time there with those records. And one of the other fascinating things about what I came across in my research is that in the early 20th century, if you asked somebody in the know who were the most 2 important booksellers, it would be Marcella Burns-Honor and this other woman, Frances Stelloff, who ran the Gotham Book Mart. And what's notable is that they're both women in an industry that was very much dominated by men, not just as authors, but in the publishing houses, very, very skewed towards men. But these 2 women in very different kind of shops, the Gotham Book Mart catered to the avant-garde, modernist authors. It was, this artsy New York shop. She had a lot of old, used, weird kind of esoteric stuff, very different than Marshall Field's. And many of her papers are actually at the University of Pennsylvania Library, which they have had some exhibitions in the last few years, and is a great resource. She was a bit of a hoarder, or euphemistically a collector. So there's a lot of material. She was into cats. There's cards, and like every credit card statement she's ever received, and but a lot of great gems in the collection as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about her in comparison with Marcella Honor, because her shop was so avant-garde and was something maybe people that didn't visit, they knew of because of its character and the symbolism that it had in New York City. In some ways, she loomed larger in the public awareness. New York Times profiled her, and there's an obituary about her, while Marcella, working at Marshall Field, kind of, even though she was more influential in the books and what people read, did not have the same public profile. My favorite part about the Gotham Book Mart is their catchphrase was,
"Wise men fish here."
And New York City plays a big role in the book. It's where you begin the book in your own personal anecdote. It's where the Strand is, which you profile, Gotham Book Mart. What I didn't realize is there was something called Book Row at one point in New York City. It was almost like the United States' left bank, or New York's left bank compared to Paris. What was Book Row, and why did it fade away?
Yeah, one of the things I've always been interested in when I was in grad school, I started studying urban history, was how certain neighborhoods become defined by a particular characteristic or industry. And, there's the meatpacking district, which has some vestiges of that world still there visibly, but was obviously, for various geographic and economic regions, this place that developed into a meatpacking district. And I came across, I was looking for, in many ways, the equivalent of a kind of bookstore neighborhood. And the closest America has had to one was in New York, between essentially Washington Square Park up to Union Square along 4th Avenue, was called Book Row, and had dozens and dozens of used bookstores, most of which had a different specialty. So maps, antiquarian, Russian, science books, you name it. And it was a hub for people who were interested in books. And it became known as a neighborhood of books. And the most famous shop, it wasn't the most famous at the time, but the one that survived is the Strand, which moved just a couple of blocks northwest to its current location. And so I think that's part of a chapter on the rise and fall of Book Row that's kind of centered around the Strand. And some of it is just a kind of wistful. I would love to go somewhere like that. There are some other countries that have, book neighborhoods, and there's villages in upstate New York, in Hobart, I think it's called, that has Book Town. And there are some kind of now touristy things of like, we're this book store place, a landmark, come here. But this was, I think would have been an amazing stroll in its peak, which was probably, in the 1930s and 40s, to walk up and down 4th Avenue. I'd like to go there.
Yeah. And one of the things you write about is much later in the late 20th century, one of the defining parts of New York City street culture were books for sale on the sidewalks, which provided a lot of people with an opportunity to own a small business, to have an income coming in through the book trade, but then became a controversial political issue. Can you take us? We're fast forwarding, I know, a lot, but it's kind of like a Book Row in the sense that it was a big part of New York City's sidewalk culture that then became a political issue and eventually faded away, though it's returning.
When I moved to New York, this was in 2003, I lived just south of Washington Square Park, and it wasn't the heyday of sidewalk bookselling, but there were still enough of them that it was a fascinating and enchanting character of the street. And again, as an urban historian, I was particularly interested in this experiential kind of magic of just walking and happening upon books. And there was a guy who lived on McDougal Street who most people thought was homeless, but he was not. He lived on McDougal Street, but he always wore shorts no matter the season, including in this weather. And I would just go to his table sometimes. We would see him. He was a fixture of the neighborhood, a character. And I was really interested in non-traditional kinds of bookstores, to think about, are these even bookstores? What defines a bookstore? Do these sidewalk shops count? And the very brief history is that in the early 1980s, a poet sued the city because he wanted to be able to sell his poetry in Washington Square Park. And there was a very long line to be a vendor, a street vendor. And most of those vendors sold food and T-shirts and other things. But if you wanted to sell books, you had to get on the same wait list. And eventually the mayor and city council decided that there was a kind of constitutional rationale to grant an exemption if you're going to sell literature. And essentially, with very few prohibitions, anybody could sell literature starting in the early 1980s in New York, which is why this happens in New York and not in parallel in most other American cities. And there are just hundreds of tables that open up within days. And many of them are also specialized. There are people who sell sci-fi books, and there are mystery tables, and there are people who sell remainders and books that they got from the publisher. But really, if you think about like what is the character of New York City, in the 1980s, these sidewalk bookstores are essential. And bookshops are often romanticized for good reason. But these booksellers represented a different kind of breed of booksellers and were often maligned eventually by the politicians who had even granted them that exemption, by the general public, and perhaps most sadly by many booksellers, traditional booksellers, who resented the competition or accused them of stealing or not paying taxes or creating a kind of unfair playing field.
Yeah. So you spent a lot of time in New York City, so we should also talk about money. You had a chance to interview Len Riggio, is that correct?
Yeah.
The modern founder of Barnes & Nobles, which was probably the most successful superstore that was a product of the late 20th century. It was a publicly traded company, had billions of dollars in revenue. When he looked back on his career, how did he think about Barnes & Nobles as a bookshop, as a bookstore, and its place in American culture?
He was remarkably proud. He recently passed away. He was very proud of his legacy. And it was an unusual interview, in part because I don't typically hang out with billionaires. And also, he didn't really like to do a lot of interviews because he had been villainized as the killer of independent bookstores. And he only granted me an interview largely, I think, by mistake. So I asked my editor if he could somehow finagle an interview. And I don't know what happened, but when I showed up, Len said something like, "So how's Peter?" And I have no idea who he's talking about. But I was like, "Great." I wish Len got sick when the book came out, and I doubt ever read it, but I wish that he would have, and I would love to have. I was planning on following up with him to see what he thought about the book. But when I interviewed him, I asked him, one of the questions I was dying to ask him, because it was a question everybody asked me, was about You've Got Mail, the film, which Nora Ephron claims isn't really about Barnes & Noble and Len Riggio, but everybody else disagrees. And so I asked him about the movie and a little bit about this legacy. And the point that he made was that Barnes & Noble crushed borders, and Barnes & Noble is the chain standing, and that there are plenty of independents still doing well, that there are different kinds of stores. But in talking to him, and learning his own story, he came from a working class neighborhood in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. He bought Barnes & Noble on borrowed money. And his vision, and I think it was a genuine one, was to create a bookstore for the masses. And he and people like him growing up were intimidated by bookstores. They saw booksellers as snobby people in their experience. These were elitist spaces. And he wanted to create a place where anyone would feel comfortable, a space that was always inhabited, with chairs and lounges and cafes. And it was a different model. But I think he did have good intentions.
Yeah, and what was when he thought about the ebook and the Nook? If I remember correctly, he had a comment where he was reflecting back on it and on the big behemoth that we're getting to, Amazon. But
yeah, so I don't know how this came. I'm interviewing him, and I didn't know that this happened. But we started talking about Jeff Bezos and Amazon, and he's like, "Oh yeah." I forget the exact year, but he was like, "Yeah, I was worried about this. I flew out to Seattle. I took Jeff out to dinner. I bought him some steak, and I said, I want to buy Amazon." This is one of these moments I'm like, what's happening? And he's describing this dinner between him and Jeff Bezos, and I'm just trying to write everything down. It's like, did you get the chimichurri? I need some color here. But his basic recollection of the story was Like he knew that he thought Jeff was genius, and that Amazon was onto something, and that he had good reason to try and buy them, but that he also realized that it was way better for Amazon that he didn't, and he knew nothing about technology, and that Barnes and Noble's entree into the e-reader in his own account was largely a failure because it just competed with their hardcore buyers and demographic who like to go to the store, who like to get a coffee, who like to have a physical book, and they didn't want to be pushed over to buy a piece of electronic equipment, and that their versions were never as good as Amazon. So he called it a kind of wrong turn. And Barnes and Noble, subsequently, they still, of course, have the Nook, but they've leaned into maybe some more traditional bookselling practices and a kind of ethos.
Yeah, and that actually brings me to, you're a historian, I know, but we should talk a little bit about the future and how you see the future based on what you've seen in the past. You end the book on, I think, a hopeful but a realistic take on the market today for books, on the future of bookshops. If I remember correctly, today a little bit more than 44% of Americans, only 44% of Americans read a book. Is that correct?
I don't know, whatever I say in the book. I don't know.
And only 13% of Americans buy a book at an independent bookshop. Presumably the 87 are buying from Amazon or perhaps Barnes & Noble, which is an independent bookshop. So what is the future of books in America?
Yeah, I have no crystal ball. And as I like to say, historians are as bad as anyone else at knowing what's going to come next. And it's a complicated, even to sort of describe the current state. This is when I wish I wasn't an academic historian, because, you know that we have a kind of responsibility to complicate things or a love of nuance. And there's no just quick kind of easy puff piece to write about this. It's complicated. There are many positive signs, and there are also depressing signs as well. And I try and be honest about that in the book, but also say something and not just kind of throw out a bunch of evidence. I don't know if I succeed in that or not, but I will say, I think the future, I am hopeful that as we become more, I was going to say digitized, but everybody's addicted to screens and their phones and have problems with attention. There are all these things that we take for a given and know. And I think many of us, because of that, crave the physical experience that books and bookstores offer. And when I go to them, which I go to frequently, and my wife has opened one in our small town of Harrisonburg, Virginia, and there are people who walk in who clearly didn't know it was a bookstore, or they're just going to the diner across the street, or it wasn't their intention. And there's just often a kind of sigh, and their shoulders just drop. And they will frequently say something, explicitly, like, wow, this is amazing. And they spend 10 or 15 minutes tasting the books with their phone in their pocket. Is an amazing experience, and people are grateful for it when they do it, and nobody regrets spending 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour browsing in a bookstore. I don't know anybody who regrets spending an hour reading. Most of us just wish we did it more. So I'm hopeful that that kind of impulse will come to bear in a way that, ensures the future of publishing, of reading, and of in-person book selling.
Yeah. A couple more questions before we go to the audience. The name that emerges the most in this book, I think, is somebody named Christopher Morley, who I'd never heard of before, but he pops up in several chapters, even much later when you're writing about the Parnassus bookstore in Nashville, Tennessee. He's a big figure, but just like Marcella Hauner has not been heard of before. Who is Christopher Morley, and why should we know about him?
He's an amazing novelist who was probably the biggest bookstore admirer there was, and I didn't know much about him before I started writing the book, but he starts working at the Old Corner bookstore, which is one of the chapters that I have. He becomes very good friends with Francis Stelloff at the Gotham Book Mart and Marcella Burns-Honor at Marshall Field and Company. And he writes a novel called Parnassus on Wheels, which is this great little slim, it's kind of like a 1920s rom-com about this couple who sells books out of their van, and it's horse-driven, and they go to different seaside resorts and sell books out of this van. And it inspires, in real life, a wave of mobile booksellers, many of whom call themselves Parnassus on Wheels. And there are famous books, so I have a chapter on Ann Patchett's bookstore in Nashville, which is called Parnassus, which is named after this. So it was kind of, he kept coming back in some kind of sign to me, and one reader has suggested that I need to write a biography.
Yeah, it's remarkable. We were just catching up in my office earlier, and I said, do you know what name I think appears the most in your book? And you immediately said Christopher Morley. And I said, do you know about him? And he said, no. And is his book Parnassus on Wheels? Is that worth reading?
It's phenomenal. It's great. It's really easy to read. It's charming. And he wrote a sequel to it that's called Parnassus at Home, I think, which is also good. And he's one of these very prolific authors who wrote a lot of great material. He also wrote a book called, I'm going to mess this up, but there's an old joke in publishing that's attributed to one of the co-founders of Random House. When people are like, how do you concoct a bestseller? Like, what should you write about? And he said, you should write a book called Lincoln's Doctor's Dog, because everybody loves America's favorite president, favorite animal, and medicine. And so Christopher Morley once, after this joke, wrote some kind of short novella or story called Lincoln's Doctor's Dog, which I haven't read and I'm not recommending that. But I always like that line too, and sometimes people ask, what do you think about this book? I'm like, well, just write about Lincoln's Doctor's Dog.
So the last question, you mentioned your wife now has opened a bookshop herself, which I guess was a year and a half ago or so.
Yes.
So here you are at the place that promotes useful knowledge. Did your research at all help with the opening of the bookstore?
It was more the other way around. So that my wife was a longtime bookseller in New York City when I was in graduate school. And it was her experience and that by proxy that gave me a window into what it was like on the other side of the counter that made me appreciate the power and influence of bookstores. And there was this weird period when she was planning her bookstore, and we were both kind of plotting in different ways, me narratively and her practically, like thinking about bookstores in a very complete and total way. So maybe indirectly, because we both visited a lot of bookstores, so I went to do interviews, and she would come, and we would talk, sometimes also just about design choices and how things are laid out and curation. So there are historical themes that I think are relevant, and she certainly learned some just from exploring other bookstores, and we've made it a habit to, try and find bookstores whenever we're traveling anywhere else, both for practical purposes for both of us, but also out of joy.
Yeah. So last question. Each one of these chapters, you really focus on a bookstore. That is, you tell a story about the bookstore, but it's also supposed to make a larger point. So I was wondering, could you take us into your wife's bookstore? How would you describe, as if it had a chapter in this book, your wife's bookstore, and what would you want the point to be that we took away from your wife's bookstore?
If you walk in the bookstore, there's a wall of face-out books. So, in the books, you can see the title instead of just the spine out. Weirdly enough, some of the very first bookstores had their four edges out. So you couldn't see anything, or they were tucked behind cupboards or glass. But so I think her bookstore has these warm wooden, wondrous shelves. It's really, I think, in some ways, a paragon of a 21st century bookstore because it's small and it's not a bookstore that exists, without sort of acknowledging the broader ecosystem we live in, that is Amazon, and that bookstores aren't or don't need to be anymore places that have every single book. People, if you know exactly what you're looking for and you're looking for something strange, you can go to Amazon. But if you're looking to find something new, if you're looking to talk with voracious readers and smart people, if you're looking to discover, then her bookstore and many other great indie bookstores are the best place to do so.
And I think Ben Franklin would cheer her on and all the other independent bookstores.
Yes.
Great. So I think we have time for some questions, if there are any.
We get down to Harrisonburg sometimes. What's the name of your next
it's
bookstore?
yes, it's parentheses. Yes.
Evan, welcome to Philadelphia. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you.
Was there anything that in your research that caught you by surprise? You were caught off guard learning about a bookstore or saying, I didn't really think about that?
There were definitely a few. There were a couple of booksellers that I profile who were surprisingly not bookish. And so we have this idea of the person opening a bookstore as, bespectacled and wearing a sweater and having read everything and maybe being quiet, this guy here. Yeah. And there are a couple of examples. One, I mentioned Frances Steloff, who started the Gotham Book Mart. She created at her shop the James Joyce Society. So she sold Joyce's works when they were banned, and she was arrested for having done so. But she starts this society based on him and had scholars and fans descend on her shop. And the funny thing is, she never read James Joyce. Not a word. She had no interest, and she didn't care. But her customers thought he was genius, and that was enough for her. And there's a similar storyline. I have a chapter on some activist bookstores, and I profile a guy named Craig Rodwell, who started the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop, which was one of the first gay bookstores in America. And his paper's in the New York Public Library, and I was sifting through his report cards, and at one point he failed English. And I was like, this is not America's next great bookman. And he started the shop out of an activist impulse to educate people as a kind of headquarters for this larger campaign. And, was never a serious reader or even somebody that most people would consider a kind of intellectual. So that was an interesting insight.
Thank you. This is fascinating. I'm wondering if you talk about, and I haven't read the book yet, but I can't wait, if you talk about the impact or the influence of selling fiction, because you talk about Franklin's Bookshop, which was just pamphlets and religious tracts, things like that, the rise of fiction in creating a bookshop, and then the addition of things like notebooks and stationery items and other ephemera. Like, how did that all come together to create what we call the modern day bookshop, or what we see as the modern day bookshop?
Yeah. So early on, because books were only a small part of the enterprise, it was very common to sell other items. Today they're called sidelines, notebooks and gift wrap and socks and such. And a lot of kind of maybe, yes, those are nice socks. A lot of some purist booksellers would say there's too many sidelines, or, there's a point at which a bookstore doesn't feel like a bookstore. The current CEO of Barnes & Noble, James Daunt, who started bookselling over in the UK, one of the things that he's done is try and make Barnes & Noble feel more like a bookstore and less like a place that sells a bunch of gobbledygook and bric-a-brac and whatever else. So Ben Franklin sold lots of weird stuff. Chocolate was my favorite. He sold a lot of chocolate out of his shop. Or I don't know about a lot. You could look at the ledgers online, but he sold some chocolate. And he tried to sell. Fiction didn't really become popular as an American reading habit until later in the 19th century. And I do write a bit about this British work by a guy named Samuel Richardson that he prints in America, and it's called Pamela, and it's the first unabridged novel printed in the colonies. And it was a huge flop because it was very long, so it was hard to print and bind, and nobody wanted to read it. And part of what the Old Corner bookstore that I talked about before in Boston was really help fiction and poetry, especially by American authors, flourish, many of whom were regulars at the shop. And it became much more popular over the course of the mid-19th century as a genre.
Hi, Evan. So I'm visiting from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and that might give you a clue on to my next question.
The Moravian Bookshop?
Yes, that's it. I just didn't know if you wanted to share any thoughts on the Moravian Bookshop.
The Moravian Bookshop, yes, claims to be the oldest continuously running bookshop in America. And like Pat's opening remarks, they keep saying that. I'm careful as a historian. When you put something in print, in the book, I write that. I don't say it's the oldest. I say they say it's the oldest. And I'm not doubting it. They moved around some, and then it became a college bookstore. I did look, though, carefully to see if Ben Franklin ever wrote anything about it, because it was in existence, and he makes a trip up there and talks about the community. But he doesn't reference the bookshop in particular. That's mostly a story of like a dead end, which people who aren't historians maybe don't appreciate how much time we spend rabbit holes like trying to, this would be a great this old bookstore, and I'm gonna have Ben Franklin walking in, and the bell's gonna ring and whatever else. But I got nothing. So I do mention it briefly, and I don't know terribly a whole lot about it other than what it has said about itself, sort of.
I think we have time for two more questions, the one back there and then up here.
Hi, welcome. There's a recent novel out by Ruth Reichel, the Paris novel, and Shakespeare and Company features rather largely in it, and the phenomenon of the tumbleweeds hanging out. Was there ever anything like that in the United States where young people or old people can just hang out and sleep in a bookstore as long as they want?
Well, I would say, and the woman who started Shakespeare and Company became very good friends with Francis Stelloff at the Gotham Book Mart, and they were different but similar in many ways of pushing the avant-garde and creating shops that were homes in a variety of ways. And Francis Stelloff would give loans to people. Sometimes they would sleep. She lived in her bookstore, literally in an apartment above. So there were sometimes people sleeping like on her yoga mat. She usually slept outside on the balcony. So she was kind of the closest, I would say, or at least one bookstore that nodded in that direction of like what Sylvia Beach was doing over there. That, of course, had its own element of being a kind of expat community, but a fascinating, shop, and then was reincarnated in a version that still exists today.
Next, last question. Oh, right there.
Thank you, Dr. Friss, for being here, Professor Friss, for being here. I'm here with my friend Kevin, and we are members of a group that's, I guess, kind of a small Ben Franklin Appreciation Society. So this question's a little off-center from your topic tonight, but you seem to be very well knowledgeable about his contributions in colonial times. What have you learned in your research about, one of his civic-minded initiatives was a library, a lending library. And what do you know about how that worked and who in the public it catered to? Anything you might know about that endeavor?
Yeah, so Benjamin Franklin had his hands in everything. You know, he started the American Philosophical Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania. These all have obviously some overlapping missions and DNA to them. And, you know, he had this group of friends where they would walk around and talk about ideas, and at some point decided that they needed to have books on hand to sort of almost have a book club kind of discussion. And many libraries at the time were subscription libraries, and the idea of a public library didn't become democratized until much later in the 19th century. So what was, you know, and there were bookstores that often had libraries, even throughout the 20th century. So Marshall Field and Company would have a library where you could check out books for a few cents a day. So Franklin was, you know, a lover of books. He printed them, he sold them, he helped start this library because he wanted to be surrounded by them, and he wanted to talk intelligently with his friends about them. And that was the impetus for the library. You may know more. Later in his life, and I do mention this, and then you could finish answering the question. One of my favorite stories, he invents this thing, he calls it the long arm, and it's when he's older, he's nearing 80, or he might be 80 at the time, and he gets a patent for a device, which is the stick, so he can retrieve books off the top shelf of his bookshelf. So he's infatuated from books. He's been infatuated with books since he's a little boy, and grows up in this house where his brother's a printer, and the libraries and the book selling are part and parcel of this affinity for literature and books.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add two little nuggets. The first is over in our library across the street, we have Benjamin Franklin's library chair, which I don't know if you had a chance to see this morning. Evan was doing research in the library. Underneath it are a set of steps that he added. This is Franklin the Tinkerer, so you could flip it up and have a step stool so you could reach up high and reach the books up high. And then as he got older, that was obviously a risky endeavor, so he came up with the long arm to get those books up high. The other thing is just going back to your book, which is, you alluded to this. I did not realize that there were subscription libraries. This is a Franklin, his model for the library company was a way to ensure the books would be returned. If you pay a little bit up front, you might get your money back, but if you don't, at least they have the money to buy more and so forth. But department stores had successful libraries. In fact, Walden Books, which many of us probably remember, started as a library in a department store. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And that's totally faded away
Yeah.
in large part, hasn't it?
Yeah.
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 So it's a really fascinating book. I recommend it to everybody. I hope you will buy it. Evan will sign it. And if we can all give a huzzah for Benjamin Franklin, and for Evan, first and foremost. And a huzzah for Benjamin Franklin. I know he would be proud of this book being here to celebrate his birthday. So huzzah!